Welcome and thanks for joining us today. My name is Vanessa Sung. I am the Interim Executive Director here at Evidence for Democracy, or E4D. Today is actually exactly 1 month into my time in the role. It's been a whirlwind, but super fun, and it's been a huge privilege to be able to step into this great transparency work that the team has been doing and to help advance it to the next steps. This is definitely not the last that you'll hear about our eyes on evidence work, but we'll get to that a little bit later. At this point, I also want to thank the Trottier Family Foundation for their generous support that made all of this work possible. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Since we are talking today about transparency around government policies, I ask all of us to reflect on the government decisions that enabled the colonization of these lands, and how the legacies of those decisions continue to shape the lives of Indigenous peoples to this day. It's incumbent upon us settlers to know and to speak the truths of those decisions and their lasting repercussions. And to learn more, I would recommend the book 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. Now, for those of you meeting us for the first time, I'll just do a very quick intro. E4D promotes and advocates for the transparent use of scientific evidence in government policy and decision-making in Canada. We achieve this through original research, issues-based campaigns, and skills training. We do this because we believe that we all benefit when governments make decisions informed by the best available evidence. And because this year is actually E4D's 10-year anniversary, it's worth touching on our origin story because it provides some context for the transparency work that we're talking about today. So back in 2012, the role of evidence-informed policy was really thrust into the spotlight, largely catalyzed by emerging news stories that scientific evidence was being suppressed by the federal government of the time, and that government scientists were being muzzled, prevented from speaking to the public about their work. This all culminated in nationwide rallies attended by thousands of Canadian scientists and their supporters, demanding that the government end their war on science, and that we needed transparent, evidence-informed decision-making for a strong democracy. And out of the energy from those demonstrations, E4D was born. Now, here we are 10 years later, and certainly a lot has changed at the federal level. We now have a government that is self-proclaimed to be evidence-informed and pro-science, and has indeed taken a lot of positive steps, including appointing a chief science advisor who has led, among other things, the development of a science integrity policy that's been adopted by science-based federal departments and agencies. So things do feel better, but how can we actually know that the progress is real? One important measure is whether the public can understand the relationship between evidence and public policy decisions. And in order to do that, we need transparency around the evidence that informed those policy decisions. It's actually quite an interesting time to be talking about transparency. It's popped up a lot in recent public discussions. Take the Emergencies Act inquiry that's currently unfolding right now. Regardless of how you feel about the use of that act, we're getting a really unique and rare look behind the curtain into all the details and considerations that went into that decision. It's really quite something. Now, it doesn't have to be something as dramatic as the Emergencies Act for transparency to be important. Just think back over the past 2 years, we've all scratched our heads as we've tried to understand the constantly evolving decisions impacting our lives. And that's just it. Transparency in this context is just citizens being able to tell from the outside what their government is trying to do and why. So in our Eyes on Evidence series, we attempted to answer the question, can the evidence behind policy decisions be found by the public? And before we dig into our findings, I want to leave you with one more thought. So in my work, I've often come across discussions about how scientists and policymakers operate in different realms. Scientists deal in uncertainty. We express our data in percentages and confidence intervals. Policymakers do not like uncertainty. And we've definitely heard variations on this theme in the conversations we've heard so far with government folks about transparency. Policymakers want to reassure and present clear messages and not overwhelm or confuse the public. But I'd say that the pandemic has shown us what can happen if governments are not transparent enough about evolving evidence and uncertainty, that this can ultimately erode trust between the public and our democratic institutions. Now, by no means is this a black and white issue. Being upfront about the evidence shaping policy decisions is one way for governments to demonstrate that they trust the public to understand the realities of an issue, even when some decisions are being made within margins of uncertainty or when there are gaps in knowledge. This will be especially important when we're dealing with future challenges, as well as ones that are already happening now, in which uncertainty is a feature and not a bug. So with that, let me introduce Caitlin Fowler, who will be leading us through the findings in our Eyes on Evidence 3 report, and of course, answering your burning questions about policy transparency.
Thanks for the intro, Vanessa. So hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm a senior research associate with E4D, and I'll be walking us through kind of our newest report, Eyes on Evidence 3, an assessment of the transparency of evidence usage across provincial policy announcements. Now, before I get started, I just want to reiterate, if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. Okay. So E4D, kind of as Vanessa already mentioned, we're the leading fact-driven, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization. We promote the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada, and we do this through kind of three main streams. We do this through original research projects like the Eyes on Evidence report we're going to talk about today, issues-based campaigns, which I'll also mention briefly, as well as some different kind of science policy trainings that we offer to a variety of different audiences. Now, before I get into the study itself, I'll just reiterate a few kind of talking points about evidence and transparency in general. So I want to highlight the fact that data, facts, and science are really crucial to making well-informed decisions. Evidence helps policymakers understand what works, where, when, why, and for whom, and it helps distinguish the barriers between reality and political framing. So we know how critical evidence is in decision-making, and our work focuses on closing the gap between decision makers and existing evidence. We do this because how good is evidence if it's not accessible to those that need it or want it? So a few recent examples of our work on this include conducting original research on how Canadian parliamentarians find and use evidence. That's our Evidence and Action report published a couple of years ago. Advocating for science in the Ontario provincial election. This is an example of one of our issues-based campaigns. And delivering a science policy training program for early career researchers that we did in April this year. Now, the call for evidence isn't just being driven by individuals or organizations like us, it's also coming from policy actors. So over the past few years, and certainly over the course of the pandemic, we've seen an increase in both calls for and commitments to the use of science and evidence-based decision-making. This includes within mandate letters issued by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So for example, to the right, we will work together to build that brighter future through continued collaboration, engagement, and the use of science and evidence-based decision-making in the mandate letter to Minister Duclos. And we also see issues of transparency and kind of calls for evidence. For example, in this news kind of clipping, where the federal health minister pens a letter to Alberta asking for the science behind the plans to lift the COVID-19 rule. So really looking for that rationale. Now, these are great first steps, but conversations on evidence-informed decision-making don't typically focus on the public's ability to understand the relationship between evidence and policy decisions, or basically the justification for government decisions. This is where the transparency aspect comes in. So as the demand increases for evidence use in policy decisions, The public needs a way to verify that it's actually happening. We have the right to understand how and why government decisions are made, and to hold our governments accountable if their commitments to evidence-informed decision-making fall short. Accountability can only happen when transparency is part of the equation. So without transparency, we can't assess progress in, or even really the presence of, evidence-informed decision-making. But from a practical perspective, how do we assess transparency? So examining the extent of government transparency in policymaking is something we've been exploring in our Eyes on Evidence series. In our first report published in June 2021, we adopted a transparency framework developed in the UK so that we had a practical, user-friendly way of assessing transparency. In our second report published earlier this year, we applied this framework to 100 randomly selected policies from 10 federal departments and agencies. This one really gives us a sense of the transparency of evidence use for policies with a national scope. But in our federated system, government responsibility in policymaking is distributed across federal, provincial, territorial, municipal government, as well as Indigenous self-government. So looking at the transparency of evidence use in federal policies is really only part of the bigger picture of how the overall state of government transparency kind of functions. So the natural next step was to examine how evidence is used at the provincial level. In our new report, we assessed the transparency of evidence use in 133 policies released by the provincial governments of Ontario, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. So how do provincial governments measure up? So I'll go through the methods really briefly. We followed the UK group's definition of a policy, and this is a group that basically started this transparency work kind of back in 2016. Their definition of a policy is a specific intervention to change the status quo at a level that is intuitively characterized as a policy by the public, politicians, and the media. So this includes bills, regulations, and funding announcements, but excludes things like a call for funding applications. And this is because the call itself is not changing the status quo, but the allocation of the funding would. So that's kind of the distinction there. We chose provincial ministries whose mandates were similar to the federal departments and agencies in Eyes on Evidence 2. And this was so that we could compare transparency scores across provincial and federal policies. Eligible policies that met that definition from these ministries were assembled and verified by 2 researchers to see if they met the policy definition. 3 to 5 policies were randomly selected for each ministry. So 5 policies were selected from each ministry for Ontario and BC, whereas 3 were selected for Saskatchewan. This was because some ministries in Saskatchewan simply didn't publish very many policy announcements, and not all announcements met the eligibility criteria. So we ended up having to choose 3 instead of 5, just to ensure a truly random selection. Finally, 2 researchers independently applied the framework to each policy announcement and came to a consensus score. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this kind of work was really kickstarted by a group in the UK called Sense About Science. The framework was originally developed to address a similar gap in the transparency of evidence use in UK policies. And then in 2021, in our first report, we adapted it to the Canadian context. So the framework really asks the question, can the evidence behind government policies be found by the public? Within each category, which I will walk us through, it assesses if any evidence is mentioned, if the evidence itself can be found, and how that evidence is used to support the policy. Now, most importantly, it's designed to be used by anyone without subject matter expertise, and it allows for comparison between different policy areas. So each row addresses a different part of the policy. We have the diagnosis section, which asks, what do policymakers know about the issue, its causes, effects, and scales? And then we basically score from 0 to 3 to what extent the policy answers the question, can you see what evidence has been used and the role it has been played? 0, as it kind of goes all the way down, means not enough for level 1. A score of 1 means that evidence is mentioned with some explanation of how it has been used to justify the policy action. A score of 2 means the evidence is mentioned and can actually be verified by the reader through a link or a citation. And then a level 3 means basically as previous, but the evidence base is also assessed with consideration of uncertainties and contradictory information. So kind of a critical assessment of the evidence itself. Looking down at the proposal section, this asks, what is the government's chosen intervention and why was it chosen? And again, we kind of look from 0 to 3. Implementation is how will the chosen intervention be rolled out and why was this method chosen? So the main difference between proposal and implementation is, the proposal is really that big picture side of things. And then implementation is how is that big picture actually going to be carried out? So for example, a proposal might be the provincial government is investing 12 million to support substance use rehabilitation programs. And then, so that's the proposal part. The implementation side of things might ask, which communities and organizations will receive this funding and how will they be chosen? So that's kind of the distinction between the two. Again, score between 0 and 3. And this is all based on the information provided in the policy announcement, as well as any linked reports, other announcements, websites, really any information that's included in that policy announcement. Finally, we have the testing and evaluation section, which asks how and when will we know if the policy has worked? This is a really important section because it's how we will know if this policy action was successful, if it should be renewed, or if changes need to be made the next time they look to implementing it. So scoring is similar to the above sections, but testing and evaluation looks at metrics of success, if a timeline is present, and then what kind of rationale supports these metrics and timeline. So now that we know how this framework looks, I'll walk us through an example of applying this framework using a policy that we actually assessed for this report. So this policy is titled Ontario Enhancing Protection for Species at Risk, Increased Investment to Help Preserve Plants, Insects, Fish, and Wildlife Throughout the Province. This was released by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, January 5th, 2021. So this is one of the policy announcements we assessed for Ontario. I ended up choosing it because it has a mix of scores, so you can see what a 0, 1, and a 2 within the framework look like in a policy. It's often easiest when we kind of go through this framework to actually start with the proposal section, because most announcements start with what the government action is. So we can see right away that the big picture policy action here is a $4.5 million investment from the Ontario government to protect plants and animals in danger of disappearing in the province. So the action itself is clear, but why is providing funding the chosen action and not introducing something like new environment-related regulations? Why was this amount of funding chosen? So we can't answer those questions. Why was this method chosen? So this proposal section gets a 0. Moving to the implementation section now, since it's kind of the method of rollout for the funding, we can see that the funding will be provided through the Species at Risk Stewardship Program. And then as an explanation of why this method was chosen, we see that 1,100 projects have previously been funded through this Species at Risk Stewardship Program. They do also provide evidence that the previous programs were successful. So this project has contributed to the restoration of 54,500 hectares of habitat for species at risk, mentioned in the quick facts section here. So the policy announcement mentioned evidence for why this program was chosen to roll out the funding. This is a level 1, but they don't mention citations for this statistic or link to any of the previous successful programs, so that we can't move it up to a 2, it stays at a 1. So moving back to the diagnosis section now, what do policymakers know about this issue? Its causes, effects, scales, etc. So the first paragraph said the funding was to protect and recover plants and animals in danger of disappearing in the in danger of disappearing in the province. We know that there are endangered plant and animal species, but how many of them are there? How bad is this issue? And what's causing it? So the quick facts section includes how many species exist in Ontario, how many of them are at risk, and then it links to a Government of Ontario website with additional information for each species, including what threatens each species, where they live, and what metrics have already been, or what methods have already been applied to try to kind of rectify the situation. So the policy provided supporting evidence on the causes, effects, and scale of the issue, and that information was able to be found. So this receives a 2 in the diagnosis section. Lastly, we look at the testing and evaluation section, which asks, how and when will we know if a policy has worked? And the answer for this policy is that we won't, unfortunately. There are no dates or types of reporting, not even to mention how many projects they're looking to fund. They don't provide a link to the Species at Risk Stewardship Program to find more information. So unfortunately, this section gets a 0. Again, I do want to emphasize that we do click every link when applying this framework. So if information is linked or cited somewhere, we do read it and consider it when we score each section. And this includes things like the additional resources links. So this is what one policy from Ontario looks like. What about the other 132 policies across the provinces? So that example that I walked you through was actually one of the higher scoring policies. Our assessment found that overall, provincial policies scored low on the transparency of evidence usage. So you can see this is just the Ontario scores laid out here. The policies that we evaluated are shown on the y-axis, and the diagnosis, proposal, implementation, and testing and evaluation scores for each policy are distributed along each row. So you can see that the Ontario ministries scored quite low with a majority of zeros, which means no evidence was provided to justify the major components of the policy. There are a few ones kind of sprinkled in there, which means that evidence was mentioned, but it wasn't linked or cited. And then a few ministries performed well with at least a couple ones and twos, and even a 3, which means that the evidence base was critically assessed. So these are the Ontario scores. If we take a look at the BC scores, we do see a similar story, although we don't see any ministries with all zeros. Interestingly, I'm going to flip back and forth between the slides for a second, but you'll notice that some of the ministries that scored highly in Ontario, so ministries focusing on the environment, I'll just flip back for a second. So we can see the ministries focusing on the environment here with some 2s and a 3 and a couple of 1s. If we then take a look at a similar ministry in BC, Environment and Climate Change Strategy, they actually did more poorly in BC. And then we have a similar comparison where the BC Health Ministry does look like it's doing quite well. And if we compare back to the Ontario Health Ministry, maybe not quite as well. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is basically that it's less relevant, it's not really the subject matter that's conveyed that provides that will allow you to get a higher transparency score. It's really the manner in which that information is conveyed that the transparency scores hinge upon. If we take a look at Saskatchewan now, ministries in this province tended to publish fewer policy announcements, so we've reduced our assessments down to 3 per ministry. We can see that there are an overwhelming majority of poor scores here. And this means that evidence was rarely mentioned. If it was, citations or links were not provided. One reason for this may be because Saskatchewan policies rarely contained kind of links, backgrounders, quick fact sections, which we did see more frequently in the Ontario or BC policies. Those things are not always enough to boost a score because those links do have to contain evidence that does have to be relevant, but it is just something that we noticed was different. So what does all of this mean? All in all, these scores indicate that it's very difficult for the public to find the evidence behind provincial policy. Now, these findings aren't particularly surprising to us. And in fact, when we compare these provincial scores to federal scores, we see similar results. So the federal scores shown up here with the Government of Canada bar, this is basically compared to our second report, our previous report in the Eyes on Evidence series, where we assess transparency of evidence use in federal policies. So basically what I'm going to go through, I'm going to walk through each section of our framework: diagnosis, proposal, implementation, and testing and evaluation, and just kind of show a very brief comparison between the Government of Canada scores up in the top row from our previous report, and then each of the provinces, so Ontario, BC, and then Government of Saskatchewan. So the first thing we look at when we see the diagnosis section is that the Government of Canada actually did a little bit better in this section. We see slightly fewer zeros shown in red, slightly more 1s shown in yellow compared to the other provinces. We also see that Saskatchewan, kind of shown in that bottom row there, did do the most poorly in the diagnosis section with the lowest scores, or kind of the most zeros, the most red here shown on this graph. If we take a look at the proposal section, again, we see a very similar trend. Government of Canada, or the federal policies, tended to do a slightly better job, slightly more 1s, meaning evidence was mentioned but couldn't necessarily be found, in comparison to governments of Ontario and British Columbia. And then again, we actually see that all policies in Saskatchewan scored a 0 in the proposal section. If we take a look at implementation, again, similar trend. We see that the Government of Canada did score a little bit more highly than the provinces that we looked at. So again, slightly more 1s than the governments of Ontario, BC, or Saskatchewan. And again, Saskatchewan scoring all 0s in the implementation section. And then finally, taking a look at testing and evaluation, this is where the trend kind of changes a little bit. We actually see that the federal policies scored less well in the testing and evaluation section. So majority of zeros shown with this large red bar in those federal policies compared to the governments of Ontario, BC, and Saskatchewan. Now, we're not saying, that the federal government did super, super poorly. Obviously, we see Ontario and BC and Saskatchewan are still scoring a majority of zeros, which really means there's no information on the testing and evaluation components of the policy, but it is just something that we noticed. So overall, we see that federal government scored more highly in every section except for testing and evaluation. Testing and evaluation tended to be the lowest scoring section, with the majority of policies faring poorly on transparency of evidence use for this section. Saskatchewan policies received the most zeros overall, with the majority of their policies scoring a 0. And then finally, very few policies achieved a score of 2. That's what that tiny little green bar here is, the dark green. 2 means the evidence was mentioned, 2 is the slightly lighter green. 2 means the evidence was mentioned and able to be found. And then almost no policies scored a 3. So 3 is that dark bar here, very, very small. 3 means that the evidence base was critically assessed. Now, it is important to acknowledge, our transparency framework is not a perfect measure. It doesn't assess the quality of evidence. If the evidence behind a policy decision can't be found, it doesn't mean that the evidence doesn't exist or that it wasn't considered in the policymaking process. It just means that we couldn't find it, or someone in the public couldn't find it. Now, transparency of evidence usage may fall short due to necessary confidentiality or crisis time circumstances, or a number of other valid reasons, but this does need to be the exception rather than the default when it comes to policymaking. So based on our Eyes on Evidence series, it's safe to say that it's not the default, and that transparency of evidence use in government decision-making is poor at the federal and provincial levels. But why does this actually matter? So in a democracy, Canadians have the right to understand how and why government decisions are made, even if we don't always choose to exercise that right. We might not need all of the information all of the time, but when we go looking for it, we should be able to access it. Based on our findings, it's pretty clear that governments across Canada just aren't providing enough information to justify their decisions, which can leave citizens frustrated, confused, and less willing to trust their governments and engage in the political system, effectively weakening our democracy. Our findings also point to a bigger question. So are government systems, structures, and resources equipped to effectively mobilize the political commitment to using the best available science and evidence in policymaking? One way that we are addressing this is by facilitating discussions with federal and provincial public servants and political staffers, basically to better understand what internal challenges may impact transparency. And this is because we can only see and understand so much from outside the government. We will be compiling insights from these discussions into a What We Heard report, which will be released in early December. And these discussions will also guide the development of a best practices toolkit for policymakers. Now, this is all kind of on the government side, but it is important to remember that the onus for transparent decision-making doesn't only fall on the government. We, the public, also have a role to play in asking for the evidence behind public policy decisions. Obviously, this can be easier said than done, and this is why our upcoming campaign, Evidence Matters, will provide the public with tools to ask for and understand the evidence present in their daily lives. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and we'll open the floor for questions.
Hey, thank you, Caitlin, for a great presentation. So as Caitlin said earlier, please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A or in the chat if you prefer. I'm gonna start with a question here. So the question is, I would think it will be helpful to ministries to provide a sample, a fictitious sample of a policy announcement that scores 3s across the board. Do you do that?
That's a great question. So we haven't done that, and that is because none of the policies that we looked at were able to score 3s. So we do walk through a policy example specific to the ministry that we are talking with, show them how the framework works, And when we do these discussions, I do try to choose a policy similar to what I just walked through, where they can kind of see a range of scores. And so the folks that we're talking to get a sense of what a 0 means, what a 1 means, that kind of thing. We haven't shown any examples with all threes, simply because we couldn't find any that existed, unfortunately. But that is a very good point that we can consider in future meetings if we can find policies that do meet that criteria.
Yeah, and just to add on to your answer, Caitlin, I think that is a great suggestion actually for the next steps in our Eyes on Evidence project, which is to work with stakeholders and those who are involved in public policy making to develop some best practices and perhaps come up with a toolkit that could help kind of improve the situation on transparency. And I think providing kind of a sample of what would be considered to be good transparency based on this framework would be great. I will go to the chat now. So there are actually a couple questions here about how we chose the provinces whose policies we evaluated. So did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, for sure. So we originally kind of chose the policies, or sorry, the provinces based on knowing we wanted to get a good mix of kind of regional distribution, ideally some different political parties in there, and that kind of thing. So a nice varied sample. What ended up happening was we ended up choosing Ontario to start. It's the largest province. Its policies are going to be affecting kind of the most people across Canada in that sense. And then we knew we wanted to do a couple more provinces. We would have done all of them, but we simply didn't have the resources for it. But a couple of the things that we had to keep in mind were, could we find news or policy announcements from this section in time? There were several provinces that simply didn't archive news releases or policy announcements from that time period. They'd kind of keep them around for about 6 months and then not sure where they went. So we had to just exclude several provinces based on the fact that we simply couldn't find policy announcements from the period in time that we had selected. That time period was selected to be consistent with the federal report. And then several other provinces, we ran into the issue of there simply weren't enough policy announcements published over that time period that was selected. So we ran into that issue with New Brunswick, I think one of the territories. It was just a couple of these smaller provinces typically didn't publish very often. And so in order for us to have a random selection, we did need to have a number of policies to choose from. And so that was basically one of the hindering criteria, were just not enough policies being announced by some of the smaller provinces.
Great. Can you explain how the I guess how the framework was developed?
Yeah, for sure. So it was actually originally developed by a group in the UK. We adapted it in 2021, so adapting it to the Canadian context. But their goal was to do something, very similar to what we were doing, making sure that the public can find the evidence behind the policy decisions made by the UK government. So they went through and basically developed the different 4 sections. That was what they felt was most pertinent to the public to understanding, diagnosis, what is the issue, proposal, what's the government going to do about it, implementation, how are they going to do this thing that they're talking about, and then testing and evaluation. How will we know if this has worked? So that was what that group felt was most pertinent to the public to know and understand. And then the scoring from 0 to 3, I'm not entirely sure where that scale came from, but applying it ourselves, it is very nice and stepwise, and it makes a lot of sense to me. So the way that they came up with it worked well for our scenario and worked well for them in the UK as well.
Okay, let's see. Lots of questions, which is great. Lots of interest in the work. Okay, I have heard the argument that policy decisions need to be made fast and can't always be highly evidence informed because research takes too long to find strong evidence to inform it. what do you think about that?
So that is absolutely something that's come up in our provincial discussions, simply that there isn't enough time either to do all of the work necessary to find all of the evidence behind a decision, or the other thing that was actually mentioned was there's plenty of evidence behind these decisions. We were able to find the resources, we have the research. There's just not enough time to convert it into a accessible and digestible medium for the public. So we kind of heard both sides, not enough resources to even kind of get the evidence into the policy decision, base the policy decision on that evidence. And then how do we even begin to communicate that to the public when the public really wants these decisions made really quickly? And that seemed to be the priority, was making sure that there was government action on something instead of actually communicating the justification or the rationale for that action itself. So that is something we did hear from folks that we talked to in both provincial governments as well as at the federal level. And we don't have a magic answer to that, which is part of why we're hoping to kind of engage with some of these folks around discussions on how to improve transparency and what they might need in order for that to happen.
Yeah, and I would add that, there are not really any absolutes, right? Even if there is, existing research, existing evidence to inform a decision, things are things are often evolving and changing, and the knowledge is kind of builds on previous knowledge. So you kind of, the people that we speak to will say, you make the decisions based on what you know now, and that's kind of what we're after. What is it that you know now, and what considerations went into making those decisions using the evidence that you do know now. And the other point I'd like to make is something interesting that we heard, which is sometimes they say, oh, we of course we went through an evidence gathering process, and we consulted with stakeholders, and we generated these reports and briefing information for the stakeholders who participated in the consultations. And it's not that they didn't want to make that information available to the public, it's just not kind of part of the thought process. So I think it's not that there's necessarily anything nefarious going on. It's simply that some of the folks involved in that work have not thought about transparency kind of through the lens of public access, easy public access to the information. Okay, now I have to scroll back up after my little rant. Okay. Evaluation of policy implementations are probably infrequent. Thus, maybe we should not be surprised by zeros in the assessment. Is this interpretation correct?
One thing that we did hear, primarily at the federal level, was that often when policies are announced, they haven't kind of worked out the finer details of the end goals per se. So the stuff we're looking for in the transparency and the testing and evaluation section simply isn't necessarily fully figured out by the time they do the announcement. So that was something we heard a couple of times, or that outcomes were really specific to certain stakeholders, or that outcomes they didn't want to be too specific about them in case they didn't get accomplished. So there were a couple of different things we heard on that front. But at least to address the first point where they hadn't kind of figured out all of the finer details, and that sometimes those details were provided at a later date, we are only assessing policies kind of upon their first announcement, when the public is really going to hear about them for the first time. And so that is for sure playing into a bit of why those scores are so low, if those details are not ironed out until weeks, months after the policy has been announced. So that is for sure a factor.
Okay, going back to the Q&A. Transparency around evidence use is perhaps more demanding than simply accountability for the information around resource or budget allocations or other facts with respect to operating programs. Is it the case that the public does not even have the facts about government operations, let alone the reasoning behind decisions? Would that be a more direct, simpler first step?
I mean, I think, Vanessa, I might let you take a stab at this, but I do want to say one thing. One thing that we heard kind of over and over again, actually, during our discussions is that often the evidence exists. There's a chain of evidence. Like we were reassured by a number of the people that we spoke to that no, like there's lots of evidence that goes into these decisions, or most of the time, the majority of the cases. It's just that it's not being shared with the public for a variety of different reasons, including lack of resources, not knowing what format the public wants, that kind of thing. So I think it's relatively clear to me that that evidence base does exist. It may just not be making its way all the way through to the public. Vanessa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Is it the case that the public does not even have the facts about government operations? I would say that that is at least in part true. Government operations are in general quite both opaque and complicated. Like if you made the effort to understand, you certainly can, and there are certainly resources on government, let's say the federal government's website about government operations. But transparency, I would say, is a multi-faceted thing, right? There are many different elements, dimensions to transparency. Certainly transparency, how government works in general, is one element of that. And then how decisions are made, or what goes into those decisions, is another. So I don't think I answer the questions, but those are kind of just some thoughts I have on that. Yeah, it's definitely a pretty complicated issue. Okay. Going back to the chat. Okay. What advice do you have for operational level government employees that are producing supporting materials to aid in policies when communicating with senior management, i.e. policymakers, that do not want to make these supporting materials, i.e. part of the evidence, publicly available? So what advice do you have for kind of the policy side folks, for, I guess, in their capacity, advocate for the public availability of the supporting materials?
I mean, I think I would start with saying that the public does want it. It's not something that, we have evidence. We've seen during the pandemic and a number of different other scenarios that the public wants this information. It's not just something that can stay hidden behind closed doors and no one will care about. So I mean, we're seeing it play out now with the Emergencies Act inquiry. There's a lot of public interest in that, simply because they want to understand how these decisions were made, right? Same thing with a lot of the COVID health measures. Why are these things happening? What are the case numbers actually looking like? Why are the mask mandates coming in or coming out? What's the science saying now? So there has been a lot of public interest in the evidence. And so one of the things we did here was, oh, how do we know that the public actually wants this? And I think if you take a look at the public's engagement in things like the Emergencies Act, COVID-19 measures, or even just the access to information program, right? People want this information. And so making sure that the senior management is aware that this information is useful to people. It's useful to more than just the policymakers. It's useful to the public as well. So advocating for the public in that sense. But I would also say the one thing that has come up as well is figuring out a format or a means of communicating this information to the public. And I do think that is something that governments have struggled with a little bit. We often hear about, oh, we're making our decisions more transparent through open data. Open data is a big word that's kind of been thrown around a lot more recently. And the idea behind it is great, but most people can't, interpret a huge Excel sheet and understand why these decisions are made. So data itself isn't necessarily informative to most people. So trying to find a way that we can make evidence available to the public, in ways that are relatively easily understandable, accessible, that kind of thing, is definitely a large challenge to pursue. And that's one of the things we're hoping to discuss more is, what does the government have resources for? Who can fill these gaps? How can we do that? Because again, we can only see so much from where we stand.
Yeah, and I would say from the perspective of the framework, which again, is not a perfect measure, but it's kind of it's a tool that we're using to kind of evaluate the state of things. From the perspective of the framework, it actually does not take that much to make an improvement, right? Often what we're seeing is that the policy announcements will say a statistic, right? It will state a statistic, but neglect to point to where that information came from. Now, it came from somewhere. More likely than not, it is from the census or from a study or, whatever that is publicly accessible. But that policy announcement is not making it accessible to the person who is trying to access that information. So simply providing information that is already publicly available and linking to it, making it easy to find. It's not a huge ask, it's not a huge step, but already goes a long way to improve kind of the state of transparency around the evidence use. Mm-hmm. So, Caitlin, what are you going to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing actually. So in a ministry we spoke with recently, they mentioned, oh, well, we haven't provided information on X, Y, and Z because we've provided that information in previous announcements. We've even prepared, potential Q&A kind of answers and that kind of thing if someone were to reach out. And so those are kind of two things that the government was doing in an attempt to provide information to people, but it wasn't really proactive, right? The Q&A approach is if someone reaches out to us, we'll give them this information. Well, if you have that information, put it in a little footnote, put it in the quick facts section. If it's already on a website, link to that website. And then in terms of, well, we already released that information in previous news announcements, that's great. Just link to those news announcements. That's all we're really looking for. We're not saying provide every bit of information you possibly have to explain or to justify these decisions. It's just, if you have the information, which it sounds like most of the time you do, and if it's already in a format that's accessible, just include it. And that will go a long way to improving the scores in our framework for sure.
I'm going to jump down to, I think, a question that is important to answer, which is, who is the public? Who is the public that we're talking about? How would you describe the public profile?
That's a very good question. When we refer to the public, we generally mean, this is a very broad definition, but just about anybody. Often what we are talking about in our context is people who are relatively engaged in some aspects of the news, right? They have a bit of a sense of what's going on. And often it comes with a little bit of technological literacy. So simply being able to access this information on websites, navigate the internet, that kind of thing, simply because for the framework, that's where we're looking at policy announcements, right? We're going on websites, we're clicking through links, we're reading through reports. So in that sense, someone with a bit of tech literacy who can kind of follow some of the steps that we're making when we're doing the evaluations. Vanessa, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say in general, it is simply somebody who is operating outside of the government, right? Somebody who does not have, insider access to, the information and processes that are happening behind, these decisions. I think that is, in general, the definition we would use to describe somebody who's looking for this type of information. Okay, in our increasingly partisan political environment, are you concerned that the principle of evidence-informed policy may become systematically vilified by politicians, particularly those on the right? And if that is a risk, what can we do about it? Woo.
That is quite a question. Okay, so let's see. Definitely one of the things that came up during our conversations was the public aversion to risk. So not wanting to bear all in case the opposing party or, the opposing public, I guess, in that sense, could latch onto something and kind of drag them down. So that is something we heard. One of the other things that's kind of been, on my mind since we did this work is the call to follow the science, follow the evidence, and how that's not always happening, but people are saying that it is, right? And so scientists in particular have been getting frustrated by that, because especially during the pandemic, where those aren't decisions based on science. That's not what we're saying. And it actually kind of then goes to vilify the scientists. So there is definitely the potential for that to continue and that to happen. In terms of how to avoid that, I would say, this might be a little cliche, but transparency, right? If you show the steps behind your decisions and it's clear for people and they can follow it and they can understand it, it's pretty hard to vilify clear rationale. It can still be done. It is still done, of course. But to me, transparency is really the way forward for that.
Yeah, I actually, I love this question. It's something that keeps me up at night for sure. And, if those of you in the audience have, ideas on it, we'd love to hear from you about it. But in general, I think, that if we leave a vacuum of information, it'll be filled by somebody else. And that information may not be maybe mis or disinformation or disingenuous information. So one of the first steps that we can take to, protect against that is to be upfront about, the solid, the good evidence that we have for the decisions that we're making. Okay.
If we don't get to your question, feel free to reach out via email. We have had a few people reach out pre-webinar with some questions, and so we're happy to continue addressing anything we don't get to today.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to find where I was in the questions here. Okay. So this question is about the poor showing of highways departments. Very specific, I like it. Might it be the case that the evidence on which all the technical decisions are based is all embedded in training and knowledge of the decision makers and need not be independently developed or cited to support bridge or highway design decisions, although perhaps needs assessment should be developed and put out to public consultation. So maybe just to rephrase, so that the technical decisions are, actually, did you understand the question? Do you need me to rephrase it?
I think I'll just take a stab at it anyway. So without going into too much detail, we have some background knowledge on some of these scores. And basically, there is a lot of evidence supporting these decisions. So the 3 policies that we looked at, we had a discussion with some folks from that ministry, and were consistently, they consistently reinforced that there was a ton of evidence going into these decisions. Some of them were some of the evidence came actually from the federal level, some was from the provincial level, and that it did exist. There were stakeholder consultations, there were reports, there were impact reports, lots of information, and it simply was not getting included in the policy announcements. It didn't even seem to be an issue of it's not in a format the public can understand. It just simply wasn't being included. And so I think what it came down to was a lack of realization that the public can't access this information and that they want to. So, not just with this ministry, but with other ministries, folks kind of saying, oh yeah, we're open by default, but oh yeah, the public can't access these reports that we're used to referring to. Oh, they don't know where to find this information. And so it wasn't intentional. It was just, oh, right, we have to include that information and we have to do it intentionally. So I think I know that didn't entirely answer the question, but that is what we know about that situation.
Well, I'm going to pick a last question here because I think it's a great one to end on, which is, what can the average public citizen do to support evidence in democracy?
Woohoo, great question. So that's actually something that we are working on kind of with our upcoming campaign, Evidence Matters, which basically is providing the public with some resources for how to understand evidence, different kinds of evidence, where it comes from, how it's generated, and then also how to ask for evidence. And so when we say asking for evidence, we're not saying just talk to your elected officials, although we are suggesting that as well. It's even just asking for evidence behind any claim that you kind of encounter in your daily life. So if it's an ad on the bus or something you see on the news, you can reach out and basically talk to the people who are making these claims, or try to reach the people who are making these claims, and just continue to ask. And so showing that there is a desire for transparency, a desire for information from the public, is a really important thing that we can do to show elected officials, organizations, kind of just about everybody, that this is important to us and the public, and it's something that hopefully we can expect more of in the future.
That's awesome. I think that's a great note to end this webinar on. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Caitlin, for leading us through this awesome work. For those of you who are with us still on the call, you will be asked to kindly complete a survey after you log off. We love feedback. We'd love to hear from you. So if you could take a couple of minutes to do that, that would be really appreciated. So with that, have a great afternoon. Happy Halloween. I hope you all have a great, safe time, whatever you have to tonight. Okay, thank you.